Welcome. This is going to be measuring your zero trust maturity. Thank you for coming out on such a dreary day and staying to almost the very end of the conference. This will be worth it. I'm Elizabeth Schweinsberg, and I work at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So a little bit more about me and why you should listen. So my official title is as a digital services expert at the U.S. Digital Service. We help different federal agencies with their digital services. Most of my coworkers help work on websites and other types of services for the public. But when I ended up at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we call it CMS because we're in Maryland, we're just in Woodlawn on the other side of 695. We wanted to be one of the cool three-letter agencies. So I've been there about 2.5 years, and about 1.5 years ago, summer of 2021, I started leading their zero trust architecture. So I'm a longtime practitioner of digital forensics, incident response, and threat detection. And I spent about a decade doing it in corporate environments. When I made the transition to the digital service, I became a zero trust architecture, and a lot of that was because of my experience directly in the corporate world. The companies I worked for had gone through zero trust transformations, and I was able to work with the corporate security teams and really understand the fundamentals. So what are we going to talk about today? So I'm going to start with an overall what is zero trust. We'll talk specifically about the CISA zero trust model, maturity model, how to apply zero trust to your environment, how CMS measured our zero trust maturity, which was super fun, and give you some tips for creating your own framework and doing the next best thing. So what is zero trust? Zero trust is a security model that emphasizes frequently verifying trust relationships. You move from checking permissions at the perimeter to checking permissions as one moves throughout the system. Each user starts with zero trust when you show up, and as you collect more information about the user, you can choose whether to increase that trust or decrease that trust. I like to think of it as trying to go to a professional sports ball game. So this is a wonderful replica of Oriole Park at Camden Yards, where the beloved Baltimore Orioles play. And when you show up to a game, the first thing you do is you have to go through a bag check and a metal detector. They want to make sure you're not bringing in anything untoward. And that's similar to running antivirus and EDR on our systems to make sure that they're healthy. Next up, you're going to get your ticket scanned. Are you there for the right day, the right time? Yes? No? Better come back a different time. This is like your authentication. And then when you get to your section, your ticket is going to get checked again to make sure you're in the right place. You're not trying to sneak into the more expensive seats. As you go throughout the stadium, you might see other checks, like if you go to a concession stand and try to buy an alcoholic beverage, you're going to have to prove you're 21. If you are going to the club level, there's a check just to get up there because they've got fancy concessions and not just anybody can get them. So that's, making sure that you have permissions to different systems and applications as you try to do the job. There are 3 popular zero trust frameworks, particularly if you are in the federal government. The first one is the NIST Special Publication 800-207 Zero Trust Architecture, and it uses 7 tenets for you to think about as you are building your systems. And they give 3 architecture approaches. This one tends to be a little bit more network-centric. Then there's the DoD Zero Trust Reference Architecture. They use 7 pillars to describe an environment, and within each pillar, there are different functions, and there are 3 maturity levels. And then lastly, we have the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model, which has 5 pillars, each with their own functions, 3 cross-cutting functions, and 4 maturity levels. I know. So this is it in depth. The 5 pillars are identity, devices, networks, applications, workloads, and data. So when I talk about a function, what do I mean by that? So if you have an identity system, there are some things it needs to do to be an identity system. We'll start with, you need a list of your users, some sort of user store. You are going to need some authentication to be a good identity provider. You're going to need some sort of risk assessment and some sort of privilege management. So each of the 5 pillars have very specific functions. You fulfill all those things and, well, most of those things, and you can do the job. And in addition to those 4 functions for identity and across the line, there are also 3 cross-cutting functions that each pillar must fulfill: visibility and analytics, automation or orchestration, and governance. So this is the main difference between the DoD model and the CISA Zero Trust model. DoD gives visibility and analytics and automation orchestration their own pillars. Otherwise, the other 5 pillars are the same. CISA just integrates them into each one, calling out specific things that you need to have visible or be able to analyze and or automate and orchestrate. And then as of April 10th, after I had already made my draft of the slides, CISA released version 2 of the maturity model, where they went from 3 levels to 4 levels. Originally, it was just traditional, advanced, optimal, and now we have a new level, initial, which actually I fully support. So traditional is just the way we've been doing security for the last 20, 30 years. There's going to be a lot of manual configurations. The pillars don't really work together. They're pretty siloed. Any permissions would be set at provisioning, and you're going to have limited visibility. As you move into initial, you're going to start to have automation. Maybe you use some sort of gold image to provision your laptops every time, so you don't have to go through and click next on your Windows. You're going to start seeing some cross-pillar integration. One of the more popular things that I've seen is around device certificates and using those to enable network access. So gone are the days where anybody could walk up with a network cable, plug into the wall, get access to your corporate environment. Now it's going to ask for your device certificate. If you don't have it, maybe you get put on a special VLAN. If you do have it, great, you can access the corporate network. You might start seeing time-based changes around permissions. So I'm a system administrator. Sometimes I need to do really administrative things. And it's going, instead of letting me be the highest privilege all the time, I can turn it on, and after a set amount of time, it'll turn off. And then we're also going to get aggregated visibility. So this is where we centralize our logs. Because when you put all your logs in the same place, you can find them later. Moving into advanced automation everywhere. Your policy enforcement is going to be integrated across all of your pillars. You're not just going to do time-based enhancements or dehancements to your different privileges, but maybe there will be changes based on risk or posture. So if you are coming from your laptop, your corporate laptop, you can do one thing, but if you're on your mobile phone, maybe it's a bring your own device kind of situation, maybe you can only access your email and calendar, and any serious data you don't have access to. And then not only are we getting all of our logs on the same place, we are also able to integrate the visibility of them. And then as we move into optimal, we are fully automated, just in time, all the pillars are talking to each other. Our permissions are dynamically set enterprise-wide, and not just are we centralizing our information, but we are also using it for situational awareness, because we can look at the history of people and use that to inform us of what is going on. I'm going to reserve questions at the end. So I was like, sweet, we got this maturity model. I'm going to take it and I'm going to compare it to our environment, and we are going to know how mature we are. And then we started trying to talk about this, and we found some very interesting things. Zero trust looks different in different environments. So to continue with the sports metaphor, I talked about how things look when you go to Camden Yards. Now, let's say instead we were going to go to Pimlico and watch the horses race in a couple of weeks. It is a very different setup. You've got the inside the track view, you've got the big tall building you can sit in, and there's different zones. How people move between the zones are different. What you're allowed to bring into the horse to Pimlico is different than what you can bring into Camden Yards. The hats are different. It's just a completely different environment that you really need to think about differently. So some of the specific things we found was, one of the things was identity in different environments. So when you're just talking about your enterprise environment, you're thinking about staff and contractors and how they use business applications. Sweet. That's a little easier because you give them equipment, you give them accounts, they would like to get paid to do their job, so they'll follow the rules. As you move into your on-prem data center, now you have to think about your system administrators and the developers. What are they allowed to access, and how should they have to prove themselves? Plus, now maybe you're developing software for the public or for business partners. That changes what you can expect of them. And then when you're using infrastructure as a service, for identity, it's going to be pretty similar to on-prem data center. You have to worry about the sysadmins and the developers as well as your users. And then thinking about devices, this is where it gets a little mind-blowing. So enterprise, it's easy. We're talking laptops, mobile phones, things we can touch, things we can count, throw in some printers, probably some IoT for facility maintenance, and you can eventually enumerate it all. When we're talking about data centers, we're talking about servers in racks. And there should be processes for buying new servers and how to get them in your building and installed. But they're big things. You're going to be able to keep track of them also. There's no physical server you're allowed to touch in infrastructure as a service. But virtual machines are really just servers without the hardware. And the containers are kind of like virtual machines, but they're just really locked down. So we started looking at these types of virtual assets, virtual machines and containers, as devices in this context. And we actually explicitly leave out end user laptops and mobile phones because we have no control over them. The general public, they bring what they bring, so those get no trust. And then we can think better about how we're going to trust these. The first version of this is a maturity model, did not explicitly address virtual assets. It does in V2. So we're like, great, this is going to be exciting. So this is what we did to build out our own framework. And while this is a very good slide to take a picture of, at the very end of the presentation, there is the link for where these slides are available on GitHub, so you can go download your own copy and look at it straight on. So when we developed a framework, 7 easy steps. Pick an environment, rewrite the maturity framework that works for your systems, write some questions to help you determine where different systems will match the levels for the pillars and functions, get everybody to fill it out, grade the questionnaire, give feedback on the questionnaire, and help them actually improve their zero trust maturity. That's it. So we started with our most popular infrastructure as a service provider, mostly because even though there are a lot of options in the cloud, there's a finite number of services that one of these cloud service providers will give you, unlike your own data centers, where every team has chosen a different database and maybe a different operating system, and it's going to be a lot less homogeneous. So we went with infrastructure as a service. And that is where we got started. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples, specific pillars and functions, and how we adjusted the levels and made them more specific. So I don't actually expect you to be able to read this slide. Each of the different parts are going to be available on the following slides. So I started in identity, because identity is so crucial to the foundation of zero trust. And when we were talking about authentication, similar to what I mentioned a couple slides ago, we realized that we want to look at authentication and identity stores differently for developers and our end users. Because of that, because of what we can control and versus what we can't. We also made a third category of authentication and identity stores for APIs, because they too have a different way of authenticating. So CISA starts by recommending for your traditional that maybe you use a username and password, maybe use some light multi-factor authentication, MFA, and that's all you really take into account when you authenticate somebody. Awesome, we're on board with this. Let's do it. As you move into the initial phase, you want everyone to be using multi-factor authentication, and you also want to start pulling in other attributes. So this is where we started being able to get a little bit more specific. So we're able to say maybe your application can only be used if you are using SASE or a device signal is available. So SASE, Secure Access Server Edge, is a, don't tell Zscaler I said this, but it's a fancy VPN. But it's a way to more specifically broker your network connections. As we move into advanced, we only want phishing-resistant MFA available. So FIDO2, PIV, maybe moving towards a passwordless passwordless MFA seems a little strange to think about. And we knew that we wanted to be incorporating more device-level signals or additional proof. And then here, well, we've already hit the max MFA, but we're continually looking at our authentication. And when, say, an attribute of a user changes, we reevaluate the authentication. So, I don't know, let's say your IP address changes in the middle of your session. That's unusual, so we should just do a real quick authentication and make sure everything else is still the same. Moving into devices, I want to highlight governance. Deploying MFA at any level can be a big lift. And there's a lot of people to convince, and you're going to have to buy some stuff. But one of the places that is easier to get started is around governance. So governance is basically what your policies are, how you decided on them, and how you enforce them. So it's the whole thing. So when we talked about devices, we really started thinking about device lifecycle. And in this case, we are talking about device lifecycle of virtual machines and containers. So we were able to remove some of the language specific to physical devices. In another part, like it says sanitize here, you don't sanitize a virtual machine that somebody else is running, you just delete it. and the company does the right thing. And we also specifically called out digital assets in here. As we move into initial, we started setting some expectations. You need to have written down your device lifecycle plan. That is a great first step, because until you know the process, you can't automate it. And that's the future steps. So you have a documented device lifecycle plan, you're implementing it manually. You're doing some sort of monitoring and scanning of your devices that is automated. Say you're running a vulnerability scanner, you take that information, and then you do something with it. And then we also called out routine patching. Initially, you need to be doing it at least monthly. And then we also have a large organization, capital O, within our cloud service provider, and we have a team that supports making gold images. So you should start using those. As we move into advanced, your device lifecycle plan, we're starting to implement it automatically. This is where our infrastructure as a code comes in, some of our CI, CD, continuous integration, and continuous deployment really comes in. We're using gold images everywhere. Our routine patching now happens at least every 2 weeks, very strict. And then our systems are able to tell us when a device policy is out of line. Because when you have a whole bunch of virtual machines and you've deployed them the same way and one of them looks weird, that's where you need to go look. And then in optimal, everything's automated. We left routine patching at 2 weeks because that's our current expectation in our organization. And then not only are you able to know when something is not in compliance, you're also able to auto-remediate that device. Probably look something like take it out of the pool for the application to use and maybe snapshot it and keep it somewhere safe until somebody can look at it. And then the last one I'll go through is data encryption. V1 of the maturity model actually, in this section, only talked about data at rest. In the network section, they talked about data in transit. But it's all been combined into one here. So start pretty easy. You only encrypt some of your data at rest or in transit, and every team is doing something different about how they manage their keys, as long as they're not checking them into GitHub. And then moving into initial, your teams are encrypting all of your data at rest, all of it. And your infrastructure and service providers make it easy to encrypt things, even if you are just using their key encryption systems. It is better than leaving it unencrypted. And then we put a parameter here that we are encrypting all data in transit outside of the infrastructure as a service account. So anything that leaves our little perimeter got to be encrypted. And we're starting to talk about how we're handling our keys, managing them, and securing them. Moving into advanced, now we're encrypting all of the data at rest, all of the data in transit, within and outside the accounts, and we have like real policies about how we handle our keys. And then at the end, we start getting into encrypting our data in use. That's kind of the next frontier that we're seeing. It's still hard at this point, but I think we're going to start getting. I think it's going to start getting easier in the next few years. And then we're using similar processes enterprise-wide, and we're doing really smart things with our keys. So we're like, sweet. We've got this great maturity model, And we had so much fun making it because we all really love talking about zero trust and security in general. So we're like, how do we find out what people's maturity is? I know, let's ask them. So we set up some meetings with a few teams that I knew better. And I was like, hey, read these descriptions and tell us which one resonates with you. So this wasn't scalable. Each conversation was taking 2.5 hours. There were at least 100 teams we needed to talk to. And it was fun the first 5 times, but I could tell it was going to get tedious on our side. So we're like, we need to scale this. Also, if we were asking specific questions, we'd get better answers that weren't so tied to, I want to get an A on this, or I want to get an advanced or an optimal. So we decided to go with survey questions, but we can't call them surveys because surveys sound optional. Within the federal government, when you want people to tell you things, you make it a data call. And then they think you're serious and you fill it out. So we initially came up with like 160 questions, and we're like, yeah, nobody's going to answer that. So we got it down to 50, and here are some examples. So we explicitly asked them what multi-factor authentication methods are available. And they just tick them off, and then we can be like, okay, you're only using PIV and FIDO2. Awesome, you're here. Anything else is over here. Same with multi-factor authentication. That helps us differentiate between traditional and initial. Although the secret is we had already done all of this work before the new model came out, so we're still grading it on traditional, advanced, optimal, maybe next year. For devices, for governance, we focused on device lifecycle plan and patching. And we're starting off real easy. Do you have a device lifecycle plan? Yes, no. No, that's a really easy area for you to improve in. For patching, we gave a lot more options, partially because I wanted to see what the range was. What are the options? And maybe we're able to stiffen up our maturity model. So somehow got a bunch of teams to fill this out. Now we need to like tell them how they did and create some advice on how they can improve their zero trust maturity. Because our application teams really want to do this. They want to be better. They know there's an executive order. They want to be compliant. So that's exciting. We need to harness this. So we made everybody a little chart. All of the pillars across the top, their functions down the side. Each one got a score, traditional, advanced, optimal, and an overall score. And we made them into numbers and then transferred them back. There were a few things that we didn't ask enough questions for, so they couldn't get scores for them, but that's on us, not them. And we also set the expectation that in order to increase your maturity for a specific pillar, you just had to increase your maturity for any of the individual functions. And even though the overall letter might not change, we are still counting that as increased maturity. We also asked them to focus on getting from traditional to advanced to start, because a lot of the things in optimal are really hard and are going to require some investment. So everybody got one of those, and that's exciting. And then we started looking at what information do we need to put out. So I looked at which functions have the most room for improvement by just using straight up average scores. Lowest ones, most room for improvement. Highest ones, least room for improvement. Even though we're not writing guidance just yet on the ones that have the least room for improvement, I wanted to make sure that we gave ourselves kudos. Like, look, this area, already doing great. We'll get back to it. And then we also wanted to keep in mind, what are things that teams can do themselves? And what are things that our team running the infrastructure as a service organization is going to need to do? because those are going to be longer term problems. And we wanted some things that people could do now. So some of them are easy. Write your device lifecycle policy down. I also wanted to look at the areas that were the most different. My theory on that was, if there is a high variance in scores, there's not enough guidance in that area of what we want it to be doing. And conversely, if there's a low variance, it probably means that we already have a strong standard for that function. And that actually matches what came out of it. So we used just a simple standard deviation. I am not a data scientist. If you are and have a better idea of how to measure this, and I can do it in a spreadsheet, let me know. So one of the things that had the least variance was identity stores. Well, the top two were identity stores and authentication for developers. Because we're using a third-party system to broker our infrastructure as a service login accounts, match it up with our internal Active Directory, and almost everybody's using it. So sweet. We actually, for that one specifically, we're like, are you using tool X to log in your developers? They're like, yes, awesome. We don't need to answer any more questions. We already know how it's set up. Yeah, and then we started putting these out on our internal documentation. So first recap, to bring it full circle back to more baseball, you just need to get a picture, pick your environment, tailor the model, create the questions, ask the questions, generate some scores, and you've got yourself a home run. So again, these were the longer 7 steps that will probably be easier to explain to your coworkers what we did or what you might want to do for this. And as a charge to inspire you, we ended up with some 40 functions across all 5 pillars. That's a lot of things to improve across a lot of applications. And some parts of Zero Trust take a lot of time. If you are going to be moving to passwordless authentication, which, by the way, is awesome, if you don't have a password, how can it get phished, right? But that can take years to do. You need money. You need executive suite level support. Deploying continuous diagnostics and monitoring tools and endpoint detection and response on every device also takes a while. Fully microsegmenting your network, great to do, also requires a lot of time and buy-in. Real-time risk analytics, a lot of time. Completely automated data inventory and tagging, oof. Also, more time. Have you seen the bills for any of the infrastructure as a service, like machine learning tagging? You're gonna need more money. But there are some things you can do now with what you have. And I firmly believe that incremental progress builds momentum. So, what is one thing that your organization can do to improve in each pillar? If you are using a centralized identity management service, encourage teams to turn on additional multi-factor authentication options. And then for the ones that have smaller user populations that you have more control over, maybe turn some of them off. Make sure everyone has a device lifecycle plan and an explicit patching cadence with exceptions for very important things. Add encryption to data in transit within your infrastructure accounts. That could be researching some service mesh and mutual TLS options. And there are also instructions out there, I think I would assume for each of the major providers, to tell you how to encrypt your connections to their services. So like from your VMs to your database service, encrypt that too. Keep your data safe. You're going to want to standardize expectations for static application security testing, and then make sure you have encryption for your data at rest in all your infrastructure as a service accounts. I forgot a huge point, which was, you might have noticed, I didn't ask any questions about encryption. That's because we're a federal agency, and every quarter we have to tell our bosses how we're doing on that. So I could go look it up. So I didn't ask any questions. They don't have to remember. We also maybe use a tool from our infrastructure provider that helps us check our configurations to find out whether or not they're in compliance. So we can also see which ones are encrypted and which ones are not. Yeah, encrypt your stuff. It's standard now, and pretty easy to do, and isn't going to cost you a lot extra. So, particularly your document store buckets that you could accidentally make public, because encrypted ones accidentally made public, way less of a breach than unencrypted ones. So, I have some time left. Excellent. My contact information is up there. Unfortunately, in order to email me at my work accounts, you have to figure out how to spell my last name. Only my parents can email me. And then my slides are available on my GitHub, eSchwein-USDS Dex. It's my only public repo right now. So yeah, so the slides that are up there, I would not recommend using with a screen reader, but hopefully in the next couple of days I'll get those up. And now I will take questions until they play me off. Oh, so many hands. I'm going to go way in the back first.
So you talked about pillars.
Yep.
But you really didn't talk about whether system model has
Yeah.
how are you measuring that plus
Ooh, that is a great question. So, I'm sorry? Yes, that is a great question. The question was, you talk about the pillars, and there are the 3 cross-cutting functions. How were you looking at visibility and analytics across all of the pillars? And one of the things we did in specific was the questions get repetitive real quick when you're like, are you logging X? How can you analyze X? So we actually made a separate visibility and analytics section, and then had people check off which areas they were looking at. So are you doing it for your virtual machines and containers? Are you doing it at your firewalls? Are you doing it along the way? So that is how we handled that. I believe the next one was you, sir?
Yeah, so did you use numeric scoring for visually communicate and use heat maps to executives, or was it that ACO?
Did we use numerical scoring and visualization for executives? Yep. Did we weight things differently? So we did some numeric scores. Roughly, traditional was a 1, advanced is 2, optimal is 3. For the new system, we're going to push traditional down to 0, initial will be 1. And we haven't done a lot of reporting upwards, and we actually haven't done very much reporting across many projects. So we thought about doing a heat map, but we kind of decided not to in this stage. We might in a future version. And we did give numerical scores for the overall pillar score. We also will graph it on a radial graph. So each radial graph has more than 2 axes. It'll have a kind of like a spider web. So you can get a better sense of like, how much are you filling in? Make sense? Awesome. And then in the front.
The question that I had in the middle of your talk
Yeah.
was about behavior analytics. And while I noticed that you had locale, and I believe you listed it as advanced, I was concerned about other behavior analytics, such as like time of day. And I was wondering if that came in also under advanced, or if you had some of the behavior analytics as optimized. I was trying to understand
Yeah.
if you do that, and if so, how.
Yeah. So the answer, or the question was, for behavior analytics, which is a big part of how we do these things, for things like probably identity, are you, I mentioned one in specific, like location, are they also doing time of day and some other things? And right now, all of that is being done in our identity systems. We only have a couple. So we haven't really looked at exactly what's going on there and how to make it better, partially because we need to do an upgrade, but also it's hard. And having come from a couple different giant multinationals, what does time of day look like when somebody goes between the US and Europe a lot? It's a lot easier here because almost all of our employees are in the greater Baltimore area. Yeah, so we haven't gotten too much into the real analytics because we don't have the right tools yet. Yeah, sweet, in the vest. Okay, did I work with any other agencies in developing this? And are there any processes that are shareable? We haven't yet worked with other agencies other than what I do in one of my side quests, but we are getting to that point now. So Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services falls under HHS. We have our own Zero Trust group, so I'm starting to talk to them, and CMS is one of the bigger agencies. Some of them are pretty tiny, so I'm like, hey, let me double check. Like, I will give you our process and tools. The tool was a spreadsheet with some other spreadsheets. So yeah, that is our next step, talking about it more and figuring out what the best way to transfer this knowledge is. And then we'll do it for more infrastructure as a service providers because we've got 2 cloud providers and it's gonna be a fun time. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, when you were coming up with the questionnaire, are you also working with auditors to confirm that these answers? That is our end goal, particularly with the cloud. The cloud providers write down everything you do so they can charge you for it. So we should be using that data, and that is our goal, our end goal, to make sure that we are collecting it and can calculate it, but we did need to do it by hand first. So yeah, so that's going to be very exciting. We did work with a designer who also knew something about survey design, which was actually really great for like mediating conflict between the different security experts and like what we should ask, and making sure that our sentences were understandable by people who aren't really into Zero Trust. Anything else? I think we might be almost out of time. Yeah, what are one or two things that are slowing people down in progressing in their maturity? I mean, the biggest one I think is, particularly because we're a federal agency, is going to be money. A lot of these things cost money, and the budget for 2024 is already set, so I hope we thought of this a couple months ago. One of the other biggest thing is just knowing what to do and having somebody else help prioritize it. So one of our bigger systems had an external contractor come in and do a similar type of assessment, and I'm like, that's great, because they need somebody who can really like sit and look and talk to them, and this can give you an overall picture and be able to point out, like, here, start here, put it in this quarter's roadmap, put some other things in the next quarter, and we will do our part and get our cloud organization to do some of the heavy lifting. Awesome. Okay. There are Zero Trust Maturity stickers up front. Happy to talk. If you would like a physical copy of my contact information, I can do that too. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.